Welcome, everybody, to the third of three components of the PT Self-Study Workshop. Once again, I'm Doreen Stiskel. I'm staff here at accreditation staff here, and joining me are Joyce and Kevin, two of our commissioners. Before we move into Standard 7, there is a question that's been posted in the chat. Since this has to do with Standard 1, Joyce, would you be willing to answer this question for Kathy? If a student's employed as a per diem PT, are they included in the numerical count for those who obtained a job, or do they not count because they do not meet criteria?
So that's a new question for me, but I would suggest that they would count, because we count people who are part-time, and per diems are typically at least part-time. So I would respond in the affirmative unless my colleagues disagree.
Yes, I'm looking at the language here, and it actually doesn't specify full-time employment. So it's for graduates who sought employment, and it doesn't qualify the type of employment.
Correct. And we've always considered part-time, and a per diem is by definition, well, it's not necessarily, you could have a full-time per diem, but it should qualify.
Great. Thank you very much, Kathy, for putting that there. Hearing or seeing no other messages, let's move on to Standard 7. And Kevin, I believe you're going to be our presenter.
Thank you, Doreen. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Oops.
And I'm going to remind everybody to mute their microphones.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So for the next bit, we're going to talk about Standard 7, which is about the curriculum. So we'll spend some time talking about 7A, B, C, and D. And then you'll definitely see some recurring themes across this standard. If we can go to the next slide, please. So we do like to point out, for initial accreditation only, CAPTE has to determine if the program experienced by the charter class should be accredited. Therefore, course syllabi in the course list and all 7A through D responses must represent curriculum experienced by the charter class. And if for some reason the program determines that they need to change the curriculum based on an assessment activity, that would be reflected in Standard 2C, and that was presented last week. So that's just a note we want to make for programs seeking initial accreditation. Next slide, please. Okay, so 7A refers to the biological, physical, behavioral, and movement sciences that you see on your slide. All right, curriculum includes content and learning experiences in biological, physical, behavioral, and movement sciences necessary for entry-level practice. It's important to note that this element is requesting information regarding what is included in the DPT curriculum. It's not about what's covered in the prerequisite courses. So we make that distinction for your benefit. The next slide, please. 7B includes other foundational content. Curriculum includes content and learning experiences in topics such as clinical reasoning, communication, management, teaching and learning, evidence-based practice, and so on. Right. Programs need to delineate where and how each of these content areas is included in the professional curriculum. Again, these are not prerequisites. These are what content is included in the curriculum. All right. 7C are the clinical sciences. And so these are the different systems, includes content and learning experiences about the following systems: cardiovascular, GI, and so on. And the program also can include information in terms of how these systems interact, differential diagnosis, medical and surgical conditions across the lifespan, commonly seen in PT practice. Again, the program needs to describe where and how each of the delineated content areas is included in the professional curriculum. All right, 7, you can go to the next slide. And so now we're going to speak about evidence of compliance for 7A, B, and C. And so there's several bullet points in the narrative that must be addressed. So the first bullet, you've heard me mention this a few times, is you describe where and how each content area is covered in the professional curriculum. And we'll give some examples of narratives for 7A. Again, do not include prerequisite courses. And an example of what not to do is the curriculum covers biological and physical sciences in the following courses and list the courses. So we will give you some clear examples of what the commission is looking for to determine compliance, right? There are some appendices. I'd also draw your attention to page 447 of the self-study report instructions and form standards if you are interested. Let's go to the next slide, 7A. Oops, I think yep. And so this is our first example. And so if you go to the self-study workshop worksheets, the first example is on page 21. All right. All right, so take a minute to look at this narrative, and then we're going to talk about some of the issues. Okay, and you can see the focus of this narrative is what is required in terms of prerequisite foundational sciences. This element, again, is not about what students entered with, but what is included in the professional program. Right? So the focus of this narrative is on prerequisites, and it should be based on what's included in the professional program. If we go to the next slide. And I'll give you a moment to look at this. This is also on page 21 of the worksheets. And so as you're looking at this narrative, does this description paint a picture, a better picture of how anatomy is covered in the professional portion of the curriculum? And so this is an example of how a program might respond where in the first section, they talk about their anatomy course. It uses a cadaver, and then anatomy content is beyond that is threaded throughout the curriculum. And then the program identifies the courses, the titles, the course codes, the semesters. And for each course, it describes how anatomy content is threaded in that particular course above and beyond the anatomy course 7300. So this is a more complete picture of how anatomy is covered in the professional portion of the curriculum. So 7D refers to practice expectation content. So curriculum includes content and learning experiences designed to prepare students to achieve educational outcomes required for initial practice of.
Call extension 223. Chandra, please call extension 223. Thank you.
As a friendly reminder, if we could all put our microphones on mute, please. Thank you. And so if you look at the document, there are a number of practice expectations. They were actually decreased from 66 plus, and they were consolidated to about 43 standards. And so we'll talk about some of those. And then for each of the elements, you need to address 3 bullets, and we'll elaborate on each of those bullets. You need a separate narrative for each test and measure 7D19 and for each intervention 7D. All right, so let's look at the next slide, 7D, practice expectation content, and the first of 3 narrative bullets. So the first bullet is describe where content is covered and give examples of learning experiences. This narrative helps the reader understand where and how the content is covered in your curriculum. For example, evidence-based practice, you may provide objectives from a neuro course, but the content may be included in multiple courses. So we provided a few minutes ago an example from the anatomy course. Think about if your colleague were to ask you, how is topic XYZ covered in your curriculum? How would you respond? We note that do not address just for objectives listed, and provide a narrative. So do not just list the courses. And we'll have some examples of what that looks like. We can go to the next slide, please. 7D, this is the second of 3 narratives. So provide 2 to 5 examples of course objectives that show the highest expected level. So we're looking more for the analyze, the evaluate, the create if possible. You're also going to include the prefix and the course number, the course title, the objective number, and the full wording of the objective, right? And we are looking for a representative sample of the highest expected level. Again, you have to include several examples of objectives. So we're looking for the highest expected levels of achievement. If there's only one objective in the entire curriculum, that is fine. But if there are others, then please provide them, right? You can also include objectives from clinical education courses if they're applicable. However, objectives shouldn't be exclusively from clinical education courses, right? And global objectives are insufficient. So for example, pass the course. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please, Michael. And the next slide is the third of 3 narratives, bullets that you need to include for your 7Ds. Describe outcome data that may include qualitative or quantitative evidence, which demonstrates actual level of achievement for each practice expectation, 7D1 through 7D43. Again, place generalized comments like pass exam, pass course under 7D. Do not repeat the same thing 43 times, for example, and do not provide exam questions. Provide specific data under each 7D. And what type of data do you have? You could potentially use CPI data, data from graduate or employer surveys. There's a bullet here about initial accreditation, where you can describe the planned outcome and how program will determine actual level for each practice expectation. Again, that may be qualitative or quantitative, because that may be based on a graduate survey and you don't have that information yet, right? A little bit more about this slide. Again, CAPTE is not looking for specific exam questions or specific practical exams. These only provide evidence of testing. We're looking for performance data at the end of the program or after graduation. How well did the students actually do? And so we'll provide an example of that. If we go to the next slide, we'll actually provide an example of what not to do, if you will. And so here's an example of a narrative for 7D11, which deals with identify, evaluate, and integrate the best evidence for practice in clinical judgment. And so they list some learning experiences, not very detailed. They list the objectives. So they have the course code. They are missing the course title. They have the course objective, but they did not include the entire wording of the learning objective. And the actual level of achievement is very global. So This is a problematic response that the commission cannot use to determine compliance. If we go to the next slide, it's another example of a format not to use. All right. This is now 7D16. I'll give you a minute to look at this response here. So in this response, the program does not identify the course number or the prefix and the objective level. There's no narrative to provide information on where and how content is covered in the curriculum. And simply stating passing written and practical exams and assignments provides no specific outcome data for this element. All right. So Michael, if we can go to the next slide, now we're going to focus on formats that help the commission determine compliance. So the next 3 slides provide the format for each bulleted item. Therefore, the next 3 slides provide a complete example of the following element 7D7, which has to do with communication. So if we go to the next slide. All right, I'll give you a moment to look at this. And this first narrative does describe where content is covered and gives examples of learning experiences. If we go to the next slide, this corresponds to the second of 3 narratives. It includes the course code, the course title, the learning objective number, and the entire learning objective, the full wording of the objective. And it does show some higher level expectations. And then 7D refers to, or it provides an example of the third bullet of the 3 narratives that are required. And it speaks to the level of actual student achievement. 100% of CPI evaluations from the final clinical experience for the last graduating class indicate that students meet or exceed entry-level expectations for the clinical performance criterion number 4, which deals with communication. Communicates in ways that are congruent with situational needs. All right. Another outcome measure that speaks to actual level of achievement, 95% of graduate surveys and 98% of employer surveys indicate graduates meet this expectation. Right. So the previous 3 slides cover all 3 narratives of what's expected for the 7Ds. Thank you, Michael. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is a slide that speaks a little bit about the normative model. We acknowledge it has not been revised since 2004. It may offer some limited examples of related content and objectives that might be a starting point for your curricular content experts in your program. Okay. And then the next slide, I believe the history of the next few slides are just to highlight some specific elements in 7D that sometimes are overlooked. For 7D, demonstrate sound moral reasoning. 7D12, including participation in clinical education of students. 7D36 is related to case management process, the case management process. And 7D39 is patient-centered interprofessional collaborative practice. So make sure you're explicitly covering all of the elements in 7D. The next slide covers a few more elements that sometimes are overlooked. 7D25, that has to do with determining those components of the plan of care that may or may not be directed to the physical therapist assistant. So this sounds like it has to do with some delegation as well. And then 7D29 is delineate, communicate, and supervise those areas of the plan of care that will be directed by the PTA. So 7D25 and 29 are related to working with PTAs. Those are sometimes overlooked. The next slide is a quiz. Providing care through direct access is now listed as a specific 7D element. Is that true or false? And the answer to that is true. That is element 7D35 on page 32 of the standards and required elements document. All right. We have a handful more slides in 7D. So we're also going to spend a few moments emphasizing some new wording. So 7D37 to 7D41, participation in healthcare environment. There's some new wording related to patient safety, quality improvement, patient-centered, interprofessional collaborative practice. We touched upon that already. And health informatics, which is the focus of the next slide or two. These elements have different wording or a different emphasis than in the past criteria. So make sure you look at those carefully. If we go to the next slide, that's specific to health informatics, which applies principles of computer and information science to the advancement of life sciences research, health, professions, education, public health, and patient care. Clinical informatics is the application of informatics and information technology to deliver healthcare services. Clinical informatics is concerned with information used in healthcare by clinicians. Okay. So this is one of the frequently cited elements. And so we just draw your attention in particular to 7D40. A little bit more about health informatics on the next slide. It's defined as the intersection of technology, data, and user for the purpose of improving clinical care for the individual and populations, as well as reducing healthcare costs. So it's health information technology refers to the tools and technology, whereas health informatics is the application of tools and technology. Right? So, for example, using databases on medical information for research would be an example of health informatics. Right? This information may be covered in a research course in which students would be taught how to farm, if you will, information from databases. All right. So here's a quiz. Which two of the following represent health informatics? I'll let you read choices A through D. And the best answer, which two of the following represent health informatics, is our choices B and C. Using electronic health record to collect patient data that drives decision-making and care, and using technology to collect and analyze data in large databases for the purpose of improving population health. So one more slide about 7D40. Please review the example found in the worksheet. And so that is on page 22 of your workshop worksheets. And as you look at this response, are all of the 3 bullets that we've reviewed covered? There is information on where health informatics is introduced and where it is expanded on, where it's carried forward in other courses, including the course information, title, code, term. There are several objectives, again, listing the course information, title, code, semester, objective number. And the last bullet, there are measures of actual level of student achievement. Okay, so are all of the bullets and the items covered? The answer is yes on this example for 70-40. Okay, and so the next slide is, if we can move to the next slide, please, Michael. Perfect, thank you. So what if you do your self-study and the on-site team comes and they produce their report, and what if the visit report identifies curricular issues? The programs can respond to the visit report. That's the institutional response. And so we're advising programs that disagree with the visit report to respond in the following ways. So address how similar or different this is from the program's assessment. So how is your assessment of the curriculum different than the site teams? If the program's assessment did not identify issues, why do you think it is or is not a problem? Right? If you believe that content was sufficiently covered, describe in more detail what and how you teach this content, right? So in the institutional response, you do have an opportunity to provide some more information to help the commission determine compliance really with any standard or element. So next slide. Thank you, Michael. Now, I guess we're going to open it up for questions.
Hi, Kevin, I've been trying to answer them as I've been going along, but be glad to have you amplify on any of them. So Megan asks whether or not we can give additional examples of actual level of achievements. And I said CPI, employment, graduate surveys, of course, particular question and exams, providing the correct response rate or the student achievements related to that, not just providing the question. And then maybe there's been successful participation in mini clinics or some other required practical experience. Do you have other thoughts on that, Kevin, that you could amplify on?
Yeah, I think it is. We've advised people not to use exams as a global measure of achievement because exams include a lot of content. But I think if you had a specific portion, if you can parse out a specific module within an exam that speaks to, for example, the cardiovascular system, that is useful assessment data. Some programs, including our own, we codify each exam item, and then we can connect each item to one of the 7 Ds, and then we can just look at how students are performing on, for example, 7D27, right? And so that's more useful information that's more specific to 7D27 as opposed to they passed an exam which covered many of the 7 Ds, if you will.
Right. So only including success or student achievement on the relevant questions or practical exams or skill checks, et cetera, right?
Yes, because they can be linked.
Yeah. And then Amy asked whether or not the NPTE could be used as a level of achievement in certain applicable sections. And my comment back was that I from my own experiences with looking at those reports, that they aren't sufficiently specific to the elements that you're responding to, sort of like a global test in a sense. And so the question was perhaps maybe related to 7A through C, but 7A through C doesn't require you to talk about your level of achievement, which doesn't mean you couldn't in your narrative indicate that your students are like one standard deviation above the mean norm as far as being able to answer everything related to the cardiopulmonary system, for example. But that would only be in addition to what the required narrative actually is.
Yeah, and similarly, if you look at what type of information we get from the content area report, they're really not too helpful for the 7A, Bs, and 7As and Bs in particular. They may be a little bit helpful for some of the systems in 7C and practice in 7D, but they could be argued to be pretty global as well. So.
And then Lonnie's just asking, but I thought we were reporting on end of program outcomes versus within program exams. It's level of student achievement, isn't it? Which could include graduate for sure.
Where's that question?
Second to the last one.
I'm sorry, I'm responding to the third point says describe outcome data, and that was specified as end of program. I apologize if I misunderstood.
If I may, I
Yeah.
think sometimes end of program data for some of these, for example, communication, some of those early 7Ds, they might be measured somehow, not necessarily on the CPI, but they could be their evidence-based projects, capstone projects, other ways that you as a program determine students are ready to graduate. You know, we talk very clinically about the entry level, but I think some of those student outcomes also do occur through other projects. It might be after their final clinic, you also have a leadership course or something else that pulled back into these 7D standards.
Yeah. I mean, essentially what you want to do is tell us how the student does after they've after they covered that content, right? So that could be in the curriculum, that could be after the curriculum, but after they've covered that content, what specific evidence do you have that they achieve competency expertise in that particular element? Lisa Sheldon, I don't know if you see that question, Kevin. Would a variety of keys from lab skill checkout serve as examples of expected actual student performance?
A variety of keys from what? How are you defining keys?
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute. So when we do lab skills checkouts, for examples, for some of them, we would have multiple instructors involved in that. And so there's a key that's set related to the scenarios. And then there's scoring rubric related to what that would be. And then we would actually tie that to student performance related to the 7D content. So we would have the criteria for performance and then the actual, kind of what I was pondering.
I think that's a good example now that I understand a little bit more, because the rubric will help you to make that determination whether or not the student has actually achieved the skill that you're testing during the checkout, correct?
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then can you see Karen Stevens' question there, Kevin?
Yes. Yeah, it's typical to, it's very typical to have uh, appendices for many of the elements. So I don't have any data to tell you which elements have the most addendums or appendices, but once you're meet your character limit, you can certainly add additional information on an appendix. It's not uncommon to look at self-study reports with dozens and dozens of appendices. Joyce, do you have anything to add to that?
Right. It's always the tension between being sufficiently comprehensive and just like overloading, right?
Yeah.
But yes, I would say that over my time as a commissioner, I have definitely seen appendices for 7A through 7C for the program to give an opportunity to demonstrate just how robustly that content is embedded into their curriculum.
Yeah, and similar to Joyce's comment.
Oh,
is-
well.
I said I should go hang out with Neva.
Oh, we missed you this week.
And I missed you guys too. However, you keep on having
You guys picking
ridiculous
up?
traffic jams that happen
Yeah,
over
can
on
you
84 that
mute
prevent me from
again?
coming in the morning.
Walk, can you
Okay, Nate.
mute yourself? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so just repeating what Joyce is saying in different words, as long as the narrative provides relevant information, addresses the bullet points, and helps the commission determine compliance, then I think you need to include the number of characters that you need to include. So.
I do think that ends the questions we have here. Anything else on standard 7? Thank you. We'll advance the next slide to standard 8. And we'll turn that microphone. Yes, the end is really in sight. We'll turn that microphone over to you, Joyce.
Okay, thank you, Doreen. And so now we're off to standard 8. And standard 8 is all about the resources and whether or not those resources are enough to meet the current and the projected needs of the program. And if you look at elements A through H, you can see just how comprehensive that the list of resources that you're going to be describing encompass, from core faculty to your administrative support to your finances, space and equipment, a library and its associated learning resource centers, clinical education sites, which includes clinical education agreements, and then student services. So let's go on to the next slide. And what we're going to do, which is maybe perhaps a bit different than we've done before, you're going to have a pre-test on the next few slides that we're not going to answer immediately. So just jot down for yourself what you think is the correct answer, or just, exercise your short-term recall and keep in mind what you think the correct response is. Then we will present the elements and then we'll go back to the quiz. Okay, so that's going to be the strategy that we'll use here. So the first question here is, what is a sufficient number of core faculty? And so does the CAPTE require a specific student-faculty ratio? And the answer is either no, yes, but only for labs, and yes for both labs and for the program. All right, so think that one through. Choose your response. And then we will go on to the next slide, which is about the budget. So which years of financial data must you submit with your self-study report? Is it just the year in which the self-study report is written? Is it the year, the visit, and the projected budget for the next year? Is it the year previous to the visit, of the visit, and the next year? or is it the last 2 years prior to the visit and the year of the visit? So think that one through for just a moment. And then we will go to the next slide. And so which of the following is not a CAPTE expectation for programs lab space? That number A, that it's accessible to students outside of scheduled class time, or B, that it's furnished with contemporary equipment and material, or C, that it includes designated areas for students to change clothes and store personal items, or D, that the program has mechanisms to ensure safety, cleanliness, and general maintenance of staff and equipment. And so which one of those is not part of the standards and elements? Okay, and then the last pre-test question, and this relates to clinical education sites and what is, and basically thinking about what is the minimal number of clinical education sites that are required by CAPTE for established programs, which is different probably, as you remember, from developing programs. A, 3 for every 1 student who matriculates into the program. So 3 sites for each student, 125% of the size of each class, 150% of the aggregate class size, or enough to provide the quality and variety of experiences expected by the program for each student. So think about that question for just a moment and make your decision. And then we're going to proceed to the next slide. Michael, thank you. And now then let's go through some of these resources and what CAPTE is requiring. So 8A is about the sufficient number of collective core faculty to meet all needs. And what you are expected to do in your self-study report narrative is just describe, first of all, how do you determine the number of core faculty that is needed to accomplish all the program activities that are delineated in each element of this of the standards and elements. And then what are the core faculty resources for the program? What are your ratios that you have within the program as well as in the lab? And then,
how's it going?
Oh, it's going good. What's up with you?
oh dear, can somebody needs to mute? Okay, and then evidence that the core faculty workloads are within the defined workload policies. And then, and we'll say a little bit more about that in just a second. But then evidence of how the faculty teaching and workloads for the program faculty are adequate to meet the program needs with regards to, and there's the list. And you should recognize that list as expectations that are described throughout the standards and elements. And so you need to show how the core number of core faculty for your program are sufficient for all of those particular needs to be met. Now, so CAPTE does not require a specific number of core faculty or a specific faculty to student ratio, as that work can vary. So it will be up to you to make a case for why the core faculty is sufficient for all the work your faculty need to do. And your response should identify how the number is determined, right? So how do you determine that? How faculty workloads allow sufficient time for all of those activities, and then how that fits into your institutional policies and procedures, how that plays out. But going back to how you have to demonstrate sufficient time for various activities, for example, if you have faculty with very high teaching loads and no scholarship productivity, CAPTE may ask you to respond to 8A that you have a sufficient number of core faculty to accomplish everything that's expected of the program. what you will be doing is for each core faculty, you will be entering the workload distribution form, and then there's going to be there's a summary one for all of them. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, and this is for each core faculty. And that's you, those of you who've been hanging around in the portal, you probably recognize this. So how many FTEs is this person for the institution? So that individual might have not just the, I meant for both the institution and for the program. So for example, I could just use myself as an example. I am my time is partially allocated to the PT program and partially allocated to other administrative units within my department. And so my FTE for the program is different than my FTE for the institution, which is a 1.0. And the workload distribution then tells you what percent assignment of that 1.0 FTE is allocated to all of those different functions, and it must equal 100. You know, I know that many of us think that we work way more than 40 hours, and so we should be able to come up with a number that's higher than 100%. And I have deep sympathy for that viewpoint. But in this case, you're just taking however you spend your time and allocating that percentage-wise across those particular functions. And then you are going to add in the winter and summer and spring total classroom laboratory contact hours for programs that are seeking accreditation. Okay, and then in the narrative, you'll be telling us which content is taught and be specific regarding the content expertise for 4A, but we already talked about that when we talked about 4A, so I won't go backwards in that discussion. But one of the other points that I want to make here is that, you know, percents are often tough to arrive at, right? I mean, there are so many factors that play into that. So there is no expectation potentially that one course equals one course in everybody's load, in everybody's load. So 3 credits here is not necessarily the same thing as teaching 3 credits of that course. There is some individual determination, but it should be evident what your determination is, and there should be it should hang together in terms of the overall report. So let's go to the next slide there. So what ends up happening then is that you will after each individuals is entered, the core faculty workload distribution is entered into a table that for each core faculty member, and it identifies their position, and it identifies their contact hours across all those terms, and their FTE institutional into the program is going to be included here, and then also the percent assignment. Now, just spend a moment looking at that, and do you see any potential issues when you look at that? So just spend a second. I don't know if the numbers are really small on my screen, so hopefully you can see them on yours. But I just look at, so for example, look at the teaching loads, contact hours, and then look at percent assignments. No, it's okay. It's just me. I'm looking at a very small screen. Okay, so let's go to the next advanced one. Okay, and so there's a couple of potential discrepancies here, right? I mean, programs do regularly take into account a faculty member's role in a course, like, and how much grading they have to do. Are you part of a team, or are you course director? I mean, there are clearly opportunities to delineate role and therefore not have those percent assignments be exactly the same. But here's something that looks problematic for sure at the service. In fact, it would be difficult to explain this level of discrepancy. So for example, Kendall teaches only 23 contact hours versus Macmillan, who's teaching 237 hours, yet Macmillan's teaching assessment is 40% of her load and Kendall's 80%. And this is maybe a little bit hyperbole, but it definitely, we see discrepancies like this without explanation. And so give us the explanation that talks about why some of those percentages may not be the same. What is the algorithm you use if you have one? Do you have one at the institution or at the unit level that is applied and maybe potentially modified in your own program? And if it's modified, how is it modified in order for you to make sure that you have sufficient resources, but that they're also deployed in a way that is equitable? There's one other concern here that was highlighted, and take a look at Kendall's scholarship assignment as only 2%. So that poses a real question, doesn't it, as to whether or not 2% is adequate to meet the scholarship expectations for 4B for that particular faculty member, or if you've just set them up for not being able to meet that scholarship requirement, and maybe even more significantly be disadvantaged in the academe, given the 3 pillars that are typical of teaching, research, and service. Next slide.
Joyce, before we
Yes,
do,
sure.
I think this is a great time to answer the 2 questions that are in the chat. Pam asks us, are the contact hours for DPT program only?
The teaching contact hours are specific to the entry-level physical therapy program.
And Deborah wanted to know, are the total classroom contact hours only for new programs seeking accreditation?
No, that will be for all folks who are submitting their self-study report, and even in the R. Well, actually not the R. Just does the R now, Doreen? I don't know if I'm misspeaking. If the R is now including contact hours per term, but certainly in the self-study report, I can tell you that for certain, that this core faculty workload distribution form includes contact hours for reaffirmations, for new, all programs submit this information.
And Joyce, you are correct that everybody does put into the R on those individual faculty pages the workload distribution based on 100%.
That's correct. That's correct. So try to develop some sort of algorithm if your institution doesn't have one, and it can be both art and science, right? But you should be able to be in a position to justify that load, both in terms of equity across expectations for faculty, but also and compliance within your institution, but also that your faculty therefore are able on an individual and collective basis to meet the expectations of the university and of CAPTE as defined in the standards. Okay, thank you. Let's move on to 8C then. Or 8B, sorry. 8B being the secretarial and technical support. And this element is asking you to demonstrate that you have ensured that you do have access to adequate support. And what you're expected to do is respond to both of those bullet points. First of all, to describe what kind of support that you have, and notice that bold there, including support for the clinical education program. So I don't think you would, but don't neglect to describe what kind of administrative support you have for the educational program. It doesn't have to be dedicated support for the PT program. Perhaps there's an OT program and you share, like a ClinEd person who works across both programs, or no, it doesn't have to be dedicated to the PT program, but it must be available to the PT program. And especially, you have to be thinking about that second bullet where you're asked to analyze the sufficiency of that support to meet program needs. And we do sometimes just get a listing description of what that support is without that second bullet being answered, where you analyze whether or not that support is adequate. Now, you are the person who can tell us how it is, analyze it. How is it adequate or not adequate to meet the needs, and what evidence do you have for that? Next slide. So 8C related to financial resources. And you'll recall this was one of the questions. So note the 3 years that have to be included. The academic year of the visit, the previous academic year, and the projected next academic year. And note that even if this has not yet been developed or requested within the institution, your budget cycle might not have arrived at those budget numbers yet, but project it. And I'm sure your administrative team would work with you to ensure a realistic projection that you would include. Then in the 8C narrative field, what you will be doing is describe the revenue sources and how each is used, the adequacy of the budget to meet program needs, and the process to determine short and long-term budget needs that are then tied to the strategic planning. And if monies come from a budget other than the program budget, then what you'll want to do in that case is also identify that. So at this time, you do have, we'll go to the next slide, and then we'll be going to the example in your worksheet. So for 8C, there's a narrative response in the worksheets for this element. And does the narrative response address each of those bullets that we went through, right? Various revenue sources, allocated funds, and how does it use the goals and strategic planning process to identify both short and long-term budgetary needs. But first things first, this is in that 8C, but reproduced here. There's a key issue here where you see all of the total allocations being listed as 0. That tells CAPTE you have no dollars to cover expenses. So unless all tuition dollars come to the program, which I'm going to venture to say is not true for anybody on this Zoom experience, that unless all of the tuition dollars come to the program, the allocations or income shouldn't include all the tuition dollars, but how much is allocated to your ongoing expenses that become part of your operational budget, your compensation budget, etc. So now if we can, Michael, if you could be so kind as to pull up the example, okay, and we'll scroll down just a bit, and we're thinking about whether or not this narrative response manages all of the bullet items that we were interested in being sure that we respond. Okay, so this one first describes the process here with the department chair who's responsible, and identifies that the university has some policies that both identify the department's chair's responsibility and the expectation that the chair works in collaboration with the dean and the unit to be sure that adequate funding is available. Then goes on to describe the revenue sources, right? And it's tuition that you see there. There is some grant funding. There are some supplemental monies that are predictable because they are tied to the students who are coming in. The grant funding is identified as going up and down a little bit. And then there's apparently a faculty practice funding that is, again, pretty predictable. So the question about whether or not they've described the various revenue sources, yes, they have, right? And they've pretty comprehensively described the revenue source. Now, one of the reasons that CAPTE asks for 3 years, previous year, current year, next year, is clearly related to an assessment of the stability of those resources, right? To be sure that the ongoing needs of the program are being met by the resources that are generated. And this is a pretty stable picture of those allocations, right? I mean, the tuition dollar is robust and stable. And the faculty practice stuff is pretty predictable. Grant funding is uneven, but show me a program that seeks external funding that doesn't have some ups and downs. And typically the programs also have some strategies to manage that kind of fluctuation. So I would say that first bullet point is pretty well described there, and we know how they're met. But then going to that next one, that last one there, describe the process used to determine short and long-term budgetary needs that are tied to the strategic planning process and how each one of those are used. So starts off, okay, budgetary needs are determined by the chair based on priority and available funding. Which generally entails a discussion among the faculty to determine their ideas. I would say that my more typical response is to see a little bit more description of how the faculty supply the grassroots kind of input to that process, but it certainly meets that guideline, right? And that model is certainly addressed by that. And then it starts to talk about how funding priorities are allocated, and they describe how they prioritize. So faculty development has the front seat there, and then senior faculty being developed into research has a pretty high priority. So the list of priorities are described there. My suggestion might be that it doesn't actually elaborate very much on the actual planning process that informs those decisions, right? I don't know if it's just, again, the chairperson putting the heads together with the dean, or like how are those priorities, what kind of planning process led to those particular priorities. And a question that if I was an on-site reviewer for this particular program, I would ask is, well, what if priority number 1 sucks up most of the allocations? How do you ensure there's enough funds for the competing priorities in your overall budgeting process? So pretty solid response. Opportunities for enhancement, particularly as related to that last bullet, yes, probably so. Thank you. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. And so we've covered this particular slide, and I think we're ready for the next slide. So here is a picture of the form that's available in the instructions and forms packet. and is provided for you to collect the necessary data that you will be inputting into the portal. Here's another important point. Just like CAPTE requires you to use the faculty titles that are defined within the standards and elements by CAPTE, the same thing for the budget terminology. We need you to use the budget terminology that is provided by this particular form, even if it doesn't jive with the terminology that's used at your institution when describing the stat, when describing your budget there. So be sure that the operating expenses that are listed here, the allocations that are listed here, that you use CAPTE's terminology and fill that in for all 3 years. There are 2 common reasons that staff unsubmit self-study reports. Either, as you saw in that previous slide, the allocation incomes equals 0. Okay, so no dollar amounts are provided. And also another problem is that the form for following the visit is not included. Next slide. So, and then when you add, this is just a sort of a how-to slide when you're adding allocations in the portal. This is a picture of what that portal page looks like. And so while there are individual expense categories listed to enter the allocations, you have to first click on that little add allocation item to access the screen where you can actually enter a dollar amount. It's put out here as a slide because apparently that is frequently missed, but it will cause staff to unsubmit your report so that you can actually enter those amounts. Pay attention to that add allocation item and click on it. My own experience is that it's a bit cumbersome, but it works. You just persist with it and until you have filled all the fields. Next slide. 8D then brings us to space, equipment, technology, and materials. And again, we're looking at that the access to all of those are sufficient in quality and quantity, and that they're going to meet teaching scholarship services needs of the program. And so the first is a classroom laboratory, office, lab space, which has to be available outside of scheduled class time, equipment and materials, technologies, resources, and then what's in there to support faculty scholarship. So let's go to the next slide where we'll think first about classroom, lab, and office space. So the expectation is that it's supportive of effective teaching and learning, that the technology is current and it's safe, that it's in good repair, that the climate control is reasonable, and that it's accessible to students outside of class time. Now note, it does not say that students have to have 24/7 access to that space outside of class time, but students are expected to be able to practice skills outside of class time in an environment that is conducive to doing that. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that you can't put some parameters around that practice that you think is consistent with safe practice in your particular space. So for example, if our students are going to plug in equipment, they have to tell us, I mean, other than the high-low, etc., right? But there is a faculty notification piece of that, so that we are able to monitor if we need to. So a note about office space then. It says here it allows for private conversations and confidential meetings. And once again, that does not mandate an individual office for each faculty/staff, right? but there must be space for that individuals, faculty or staff, depending on their roles, to have the private conversations, confidential meetings that might be warranted based on their interactions. And it has to have secure storage for office equipment, student files, and other confidential materials. And I think that more and more we are getting away from paper storage for sure, but that doesn't negate the principle of what this is referring to, that there have to be parameters that maintain the confidentiality of the documents that are being stored, whether that be electronic or physical. Next slide. So equipment must be reflective of contemporary practice, right? And it has to be maintained and safe. And you should have available maintenance agreements and evidence of inspections on site. You don't need to include your inspection protocols and evidence in the self-study report, but on site you will have your maintenance agreements and your inspection evidence of that and its frequency. You have to demonstrate that you have enough. Like if you had one plinth and 40 students, that's a ridiculous example, but you get my point. Is there enough equipment for everyone to practice in a way that's meaningful, to be able to, for the students to meet the learning objectives of the course and of the program. Program does not have to own all of the equipment, but it must be available for testing and remediation. So if it's a key piece of equipment that you rent for purposes of instruction, to have it available only during that laboratory time when it is covered and then it goes away is going to be potentially problematic for this, because students have to be able to be tested and to be remediated if they don't meet entry-level expectations on that. And then technology resources, do they meet the needs of the program, including the instructional needs of the program? Next slide. This relates back now to the individual faculty needs. And you need to identify the space and equipment needs for each core faculty member to carry out the agenda. So just a quick word, this needs to connect back to the scholarship agendas that your core faculty submitted in 4B. So as you are answering 8D6, make sure that you have the scholarship agendas in front of you so that you can substantiate the space and equipment for each of those faculty scholarship agendas, and that it's adequate, because this will be done by an individual at the person level, at the faculty level, right? It's not going to be just a comprehensive list of what's available. It's going to be what's available for that particular faculty based on their particular scholarship needs. Okay. And so just as another example, what if a faculty member said that gait analysis in the case of ataxia is the most important part of her research area, but there's no space or equipment to carry out that agenda? That would be problematic. The space and equipment doesn't have to be on site. Maybe there's a nearby accessible or nearby facility that particular faculty member has access to, and that's perfectly okay. That's perfectly okay. You just need to be able to describe that for each individual faculty member. Next slide. And then we're off to clinical sites. So clinical sites available to the program are sufficient to provide the quality, quantity, and variety. Okay, quality, quantity, and variety of expected experience to prepare PTs for their roles and responsibilities as PTs. So you're going to hark back to what you said in 6L. Remember, 6L was about what were the clinical experiences required of each student. or maybe refer back to them, but then you're gonna you're gonna describe the process to determine that the clinical sites offer experiences consistent with those goals and with the objectives of the individual ClinEd courses, and then how you ensure a sufficient number and variety of clinical ed sites to support those goals and to meet the objectives. Okay, so it doesn't require you to have a particular percentage above your class size, but you have to, for each student, have the adequate quality, quantity, and variety to meet the clinical education needs as described in your program and for your students. Next slide. And then in the appendices, you're gonna have the clinical education placements available forms packet for the number of sites needed, what's available, and the aggregate results of the request for clinical education. And that's for the year of the site visit. And then for the most recent graduating class, the table demonstrating each student had experiences required for the program and meet 6L 1 through 5. Okay, and again, we said that when we talked about it at during our discussion of standard 1, but this is again going to be at the student level. So it's not going to be sufficient to summarize, that you had X number of sites and 75% of your students had experiences here and 25% there. It's at each student. Did they do it across the continuum of care and across the lifespan? Did they have the required experiences? And then you're also going to include in the appendix the list of clinical education sites that have accepted at least one student annually in the last 2 years. So each site that had a student in the last 2 years. The on-site materials, and we make a point of this too, is that must include the clinical education files, including the signed written agreements. Now, I know that most of these days, thank goodness, are not in paper form. They're electronically maintained somewhere. So you'll have to find some way of getting access for your student, not for your student, for your site visitors to be able to review that. It's not really sufficient to say, here's a representative example. Maybe your site visitors are only looking at a representative example, but they should have available to them all of the clinical files upon request. Next one. And then student support services. This is one of those areas that we're rarely going to see citations. You did not see it on the frequently cited list because really many of these services are also required, aren't they, by regional accreditors. And so it's rarely an issue for most programs. But do a decent job of describing what those services are. If you have students at a distance, identify or substantiate that they are not disadvantaged by being at a distance, but that they also have access to the services listed here on 8H. Since they are your student as well, they should also have access to the required support services, even when not physically on campus. So now we're going to go to our post tests and how well did you do? So the answer to this is there a required student faculty ratio? The answer is no. There is no required ratio. Can I just hang there for just a second? But you will need to, it should pass the sniff test, if you will, right? So if you have ratios that are are unusual, you're gonna, particularly, of course, unusual in the sense that you have one faculty and many students, you're gonna need to be able to substantiate that you manage that environment well. Next. And so we've said this, and I'm sure it does not bear repeating. The answer to that is C. Next. Okay, you are not required to have an area for students to change clothes and store personal items. Now, mind you, it is certainly conducive to your students who spend as many hours as they do in your area, but it is not a CAPTE requirement. It's just a very nice to have kind of a thing. Next. Clinical sites. The answer to that is D, enough to provide the quality and variety of experiences expected by the program for each student. Now, in the case of a developing program, or in the case of application for substantial change that includes an expansion of class size, then you're going to have to demonstrate that you have 150% of the needed sites for each variety that you need. So there is a metric there that's specific, but otherwise you're looking at D, where you're going to provide the quality and variety of experiences required by for each student. Next slide. And I think that comes to the end of our standards and elements. Are there questions that weren't answered that I can maybe help answer?
Quite a few, Joyce.
Mm-hmm.
We'll let you take a good sip of water there. And I want to start with a question about 8F, the available clinical education placements. Donna wants to know, how does CAPTE require reporting of the placements for each clinical education experience, given that this can be a, quote, moving target across an annual cycle and is subject to variation from year to year for a number of reasons? Is this for previous years or for the year of the visit? In short, we know that the demand and it is harder to accurately capture the supply.
Yeah, and I think you're entirely correct, Donna, just how difficult that is. But you're required to do two things. First of all, you're required to have a list of your students, like in that last clinical the last cohort that went through all the clinical rotations for the program. So they are either in the last clinical rotation or have finished the last clinical rotation in the program prior to the visit. And then you're going to complete for each one of those students, like what type of sites they completed, and whether or not, and how they completed all the expectations for your program and for 6L 1 through 5. And that'll be at the student level. So you'll be listing the students, and then you follow it out onto the x-axis for each one of those areas. And then the second piece of that is that you will be describing for the which one of your clinical sites took a student for each of the last 2 years. So that's the second specific listing. And you're right that there's going to be a lot of variation in it, and there's a lot of accommodations that we've all had to make because of what COVID has done to the availability of clinical sites. If you have a student who looks like they've got a gap, but you've met that gap in an unusual way. So, for example, in our lifespan requirements, not all of our students have pediatric experiences, but they've all visited pediatric clinics within their pediatric, within the course that covers that content. And so for those particular students, we identify that within that tracking form, so that we can substantiate that they have what was needed even if it wasn't a clinical education experience. So I don't know if
Joyce,
that helps answer.
I think that did, and I think this also ties directly with Katie, who wanted to know of this list, does it apply only to the full-time and not the integrated? Or,
Yeah, do the integrated too, particularly unless you don't need the integrated to show that you meet all of the expectations, but use all of your clinical education experiences. You'll demonstrate to everyone a much more robust compliance with both your expectations as well as those identified by the standards and elements.
okay, we're going to go back. Donna is asking to unmute and speak. So Donna, why don't you come to the floor?
Hi, Joyce and
Hi.
Doreen. Thank you. You did a great job answering the question. I'm wondering if you can go back to the slide on 8F. There was one specific part that I'm not clear on. And it was where there was a comment in red about the it is the year of the site visit.
Right there.
For AY of site visit. Okay.
Yeah.
So number of sites needed, number of sites available based on aggregate results of requests for clinical education placements for AY of site visit. So unless I'm misunderstanding it, what I'm hearing is that whenever our self-study is due, we need to have sort of the supply and demand for that academic year. And
Yes.
so that's the piece that for me is like, okay, I know this is a moving target. If you're asking me at any point in time during an academic year, where are we? I can tell you we'll be fine, but for some placements, we may not be there yet, depending on when it is. Maybe it's a semester ahead and we're not quite there in terms of commitments, but we can certainly provide the history and the narrative and the other appendices where we're talking about the most recent graduating class. What did they do? And did they have sufficient variety, et cetera? So my question is specific to that first bullet.
Yeah, no, no, that makes total sense, Donna. Thank you for clarifying that. And you're right. What a moving target, isn't it? And I think that answering it the best you can at the time you can is appropriate. But then if you add in the history of always successfully garnering what you need to garner to get to have the adequate resources and updating it during the site visit, even updating it at the time that before the commission meeting, you're still allowed to put in additional materials. So I would say do the best you can with the information you have. If you want to narratively describe your history, I think that's completely appropriate, but then feel free to update that information as additional sites and securement becomes available. I don't know if my colleagues have anything to add.
Thank you.
I'm just going to add that is kind of a prelude to what will come as our closing comments, that this is a process. Your self-study is not a one and done type of event, that you submit that, the visit occurs within 60 days of that. The team leader will be reaching out. There's opportunity to confirm. You do get a visit report. You have, again, opportunities to respond with more updated information all the way up to the time that the commission meets. And we'll be re-highlighting those pieces.
Thank you.
And before we go to Pam's question, I just want to stay with Clin Ed here. We had
Katie asked the question.
Katie.
Right? Yes.
Katie, would you please, if you can, unmic and address specifically what your question was that we did not quite answer fully?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to clarify for that third bullet that's on there, that listing clinical education sites that have accepted at least one student. If that includes both, or can we include both integrated and full-time or terminal experiences? I understand that we would include that for the student level list for the most recent graduating class, but just wanted to clarify for that third bullet, if we would also include integrated sites or sites we use for our integrated experiences.
I would say the answer to that is yes.
Thank you.
You bet.
Great. And then we had a question about how do you handle clinics, the multi-site corporation clinic? Does the entire corporation count as one site, et cetera? So Kurt is wanting to know that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I wish that my clinical education director was here to answer it better than I could, but I would say that it counts as more than one site. I would say that, particularly if it has, geographically distinct places with different types of services provided, I would list those separately. And just be clear, you can even include like different denotations on there that identifies and distinguishes it as a subset of that greater facility. Again, I would invite my colleagues to add to that if you have anything more.
That's exactly right, Joyce. That's how the applications for candidacy are handled. If a clinical contract delineates multiple clinical sites through the LOIs, and each one of those LOIs is counted as an individual site.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have one signed contract, but if you have 15 select physical therapy clinics that you're sending your students to, then they would count for 15 individual sites.
Great. Any other 8 questions?
And we just have one general one, and I'm not sure that anybody on this call will be able to answer it. But in the past, additional materials could be submitted on a CD or through a thumb drive or et cetera. Is CAPTE accepting that at this time?
I don't think CAPTE accepts thumb drives, right? I mean, you can give them to your site visitors. I'm looking for where that question is.
Yeah, that was the materials on site. I'm sorry. Can they be available on a CD for the site visitors as in the past?
I would say yes, right? Although if you gave me a CD, my computer doesn't handle CDs, but yes, I'm sorry.
We've been given flash drives so that when the on-site team is there, they can continue to review documents in their hotel room without bringing boxes and boxes of papers and files. So I know that's been a practice recently in lieu of boxes of files.
Right, and I do believe that that's the case. In the case of the virtual visits, though, that's where the team does need some sort of cloud-based or file-based sharing. And I believe our instructions say 2 weeks prior to the visit so that they can start going through that. So we're hoping that once we get back into all full on-site visits again, we can have, again, a use of a thumb drive, a CD, or some other way for sharing those on-site materials that are then left with the program. Okay. Having no other questions here, or did I? No, we have a secretarial support question here. Sherry wants to know, how do you demonstrate adequacy of secretarial support? Do you need to have examples of exactly how this has been analyzed successfully?
So I can tell you of examples of how I've seen it done after the description of the support and the functions that, if you can point to successful outcomes of the program unit as a whole and timely responses. And sometimes we have graduate surveys that also talk about, satisfaction with those kind of activities. All of those can contribute to adequacy. But I think that the program director, the faculty, in collaboration with others, can themselves decide, what is adequacy and what are those measures. But things such as support of those functions, timely interactions where warranted, basically the job gets done, right? The equipment gets managed, etc. I don't know.
Great.
Anybody else have anything else on that?
I would consider including, for example, annual staff reviews, which makes reference to their roles and responsibilities and to the extent in which they're fulfilling all of their responsibilities. That could serve as evidence as well.
That's a good point.
Thank you, Kevin and Joyce. We have gone about an hour and 40 minutes. I think this is a great time for a very short 10-minute break, and then we'll do our wrap up. So it is on the East Coast 3:40. We'll convene at 10 minutes of. And we thank you all. Continue to post any questions that you may have. Welcome back, everyone. While we're waiting for everybody to return, we do have a question. And the question comes from Chris regarding the 7Ds. I don't know if Kevin is back. He is able to answer that. If an exam covers wound management and lymphedema management, is it necessary to do an analysis of just the lymphedema content? Could you please address this again?
Oh, yeah, I just give me 1 second. I don't even think. So the lymphatic content is part of 7C, so it would be helpful to be able to look at data specific to lymphatic and specific to integumentary. And let me see if I'm answering your question. Right, so I think that would help with being able to look at maybe a specific system. Just integumentary and just lymphatic would be helpful for you to demonstrate student achievement for those two specific systems, as opposed to referencing an exam score that covers multiple systems. I hope that answers your question, Grace. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that does. So we are going to advance the slides and come to some of our final thoughts. Probably the first and foremost piece of advice we can give you is to follow the instructions. We can't say it often enough. It's important to keep going back to the instructions and the forms for the required packet. There's a couple other documents that from the self-study workshop that will be helpful that we'll be talking about as well. And I think that for all of you attending this meeting is you should now have sparks of ideas of how you can start to plan or schedule the development of the self-study workshop. We really suggest you create an idea of almost a master plan or a major project development piece. And you are going to recruit or you're going to assign individuals who are very detail oriented who can collect or who can review documents and responses. They can be individuals who maybe are your admissions committee going to do some of that piece to it. Your DCEs obviously are going to be the ones that can really speak to the clinical education components, to the SREs, et cetera. And you want to make sure that everybody who is working on this also has the same instructions and they follow it consistently. I think that what you also want to do is also start to assess when you need to make changes and you start doing that early. So, for example, it might be that you are looking at some of these 7Ds that Kevin had talked about, and you have upper division or later courses in the curriculum that your course objectives are really written at a higher level using Bloom's taxonomy. And you go and you look at the exam, and the exam, those questions are really asking very foundational, very lower level. What is, define this type of thing. So you want to be able to go back and look at your course objectives. Is it really reflective of the course content you're teaching? Are those course objectives written in measurable or behavioral terms? And is it really reflecting that transition up to entry-level practice? And so obviously, as you have faculty discussions or curriculum committee discussions, these are changes that you want to make sure are captured in your syllabi so that you can have those most current syllabi then to begin writing. So we kind of help you think of ways to facilitate this process. Another thing in planning in your scheduling, while you want to start early, one of the later, kind of that midpoint pieces to go through is to create CVs and scholarship forms that really reflect currency. You don't want to do these too early. You don't want to write them so that they are, for example, the scholarship forms that people are saying their dissemination plans really at the time you're writing them might be for 2 or 3 years, but at the time of the self-study, they reflect all past tense. So this is important for you to be thinking about, that the format for them needs to be consistent as well as current and up to date. We had said this earlier, we had talked about this, that there are multiple opportunities to provide information. So just as we had talked about clinical ed sites and commitments being a moving target, that's okay. You have that opportunity when you submit your self-study to submit materials before or at the time of the site visit. There's an institutional response and all the way up to the time of the commission meeting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that last piece later. Should you have any questions, please contact us as staff. And that's myself and Michael who are working with the PT programs to help get you that information to create a really strong self-study. In the portal, remember you can download, you could review your answers as you go along. Don't wait to the end to kind of validate and to hit, just as you may or may not have done when you do your R. This is much greater than that R, so please make sure you're doing this. We said at the top of the workshop make sure, or our best advice is create your answers in a Word document and then paste them into the portal. That's really helpful to do because it really helps with some getting rid of some hidden codes, helping with formatting, etc. Here's another tip that we may not have shared with you, that only one person is allowed to log into the portal at the time. So if you're working on syllabi, you can't have 3 or 4 people uploading their respective syllabi at the same time. So it does take time to enter these documents, to do the appendices, to write the response, and to link those appendices. So make sure you're also allowing time just for interfacing with the portal. Um, as we had talked about, that after your self-study is submitted, or even as you're writing the self-study, you might be putting up some revised documents. An example that I can think about that might relate to that, if you're planning to submit your self-study in September, October for a late fall meeting, and your institution hasn't published its current catalog, you want to at least have a graduate catalog there, and recognize that, oh, a new one's going to come out. Oh, it came out right before you're ready to hit submit. So you want to delete that old catalog and you want to maybe put the new one in. And so one of the things we also tell people is that you can include a date in the file name. So if it's the institutional catalog, you could put then 21, 22 for that academic year. That might be the same naming convention you would use for meeting minutes or other things where it's going to look repetitive across. Should you run into any issues about you're not sure if you have the latest version or not, that's another great example that you can call and ask staff, because we can see the time and the date that you've uploaded. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. Next slide, Mike. So the portal information, and I did want everybody to recognize that when you go back to the self-study workshop materials, there is a other hyperlink on there called the information for directions for submitting accreditation reports on the CAPTE accreditation portal. So again, if these next few slides feel a little overwhelming, etc., they're fully delineated in that hyperlinked file attached to this website. So one of those other things, as you're working with a portal, make sure you can allow pop-ups and other things. So check the instructions that we give you. And there are a number of web browsers that are fairly user-friendly with our portal. And that can be Chrome 22 or higher, Firefox 27 or higher, Safari 5 or higher, for putting in your narratives. Currently, the only browser that supports downloading and uploading WinZip files is Internet Explorer. So you may need to work with your institution to make sure that IE is supported on your laptop or your desktop or your machine so that you can do this. So one pleasant thing is HTML code is no longer required. So you don't have to worry about that. You'll see some of older slides that we're using that has that in there. Please disregard that. We're going to talk a little bit about URLs. We had talked about that before, that the URLs are for any item that's requested, that you must kind of use that. We don't want you to put in a URL for something that lives on your intranet or something that's password protected. So maybe, for example, you want to cite something from your faculty senate or something else that requires you to log in as an individual for that. You're going to have to provide that document because CAPTE cannot do, through the portal, we cannot do all of these pieces. Appendices, again, we're going to talk about that the appendices, please pay attention to the required naming conventions. In the rules, I'm sorry, in the instructions for self-study, it's going to say CV hyphen last name, first name of the faculty, scholarship for the same faculty. So when the commissioners and the on-site reviewers are looking at the CVs, they're going to see all CVs listed in the same place. You only need to upload any appendix once. So for example, your program student handbook, that might be referenced in multiple places. You only have to upload it once, and we'll talk about attaching it at other places. And I'll also get into a little bit more detail about how do you delete an appended document. There's some ways for you to take a document out. Let's say you meant to put in the institutional student handbook and somehow you appended to an element the student handbook. There's a way that you can delete that out from that, but maybe you put in a document like last year's institutional graduate catalog that you now want to take out of the system completely. We'll show you some things for that. And remember, those instructions are all in that using that portal information from all of this. Mike, the next slide. Thank you so much. So here's a little quiz question for you. This is what the portal looks like when you see at the top, we have 1C5 there and the required standard and element to this. You could see there are some top 4 appendices there, and this program has chosen to put 2 appendices, and then you can see some of the narrative here. So if you didn't want this appendices to be anywhere in the self-study report, could you hit this delete button? Yes or no? The answer is false, because as I started to this narrative to walk through, you see it says 1C5. This is a particular element. If you deleted that document there, like I think it says the planning document, it will just take it away from the element. It will not delete it from the entire self-study report. And again, if you go back to those instructions for submitting on the portal, page 30 has that information. Next slide. So what you see here is exactly what I just said that is blown up. In that gray box there, if you were to hit that delete, it would only detach that that appendix from that particular element. But let's say you did want to add something additional. You see underneath here, it's added new appendix. So you can click on that and then it would show as a third document on this. Okay, next slide. So this is what the portal looks like for all the appendices that you upload. And when you look at this, you can see that the very large gray arrow from the top, that let's say you put in a clinical ed written agreement, it had track changes all over it. And it wasn't until you looked at the document you recognized there was an error. This is where you would click on this to take this completely out of the self-study. If, however, you were answering the clinical ed agreement, one of those standard 8s there, and you did want it to be attached to that element, that's where you click select and it goes from there. If, let's say, you're starting and you have no appendices here, and you have now just created the scholarship forms for all of your faculty, You can see the bottom gray arrow here. It says use this to add a new appendix. So you would start by uploading scholarship, Maring, Joyce, and it would go, and you could see that browse there. And then the next one would be scholarship, Chi, Kevin, et cetera, et cetera. And then they will populate into the appendices. And it does a running list in alphabetical order. So if you look at the very small piece at the bottom, you can see there's numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 that goes all the way through. So you're allowed as many appendices as you would like. Okay, next slide. We're still going to talk about appendices before we get to some of those questions there. So here's that true false quiz for you. All appendices should be uploaded from the home portal page using the upload additional materials tab, which I have highlighted down at the bottom. That answer is no. We just showed you how to upload your materials within the portal itself through the appendices. The additional materials, you would only use that if you have submitted your self-study report and you have new information that you want to have reviewed by CAPTE. You have up to 30 days prior to the start of the commission's meeting that on which your program is being reviewed, unless one of the commissioners specifically said in that 30-day window, I want you to upload a new CV for X person, or great, and I'm going to use Donna's question. Donna, thank you for sharing that you have new information on your clinical site availability. I think that would be helpful to the commission. Please upload that as additional materials. Okay, so that answer was false there. Let's go to the next slide. So your self-study grid report. Again, we have arrows 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to walk you through different pieces. So when you're in your portal, you're going to see this self-study. That number 1 is kind of where you want to start. This is about information to you. You can find things that will assist you in completing your self-study report. So we really encourage you to go there first, read through all the documents before you start entering data into your self-study. So now if you look over on the right-hand side under that status column, you can see there's things called in progress or to-do lists. This is giving you the current status of where things are. They're all going to say in progress up until the point that you click submit. So even though you might have answered everything and uploaded everything about faculty or everything about general information, until you hit that submit button, which we'll talk about lies in number 3 area, you're going to have in progress, in progress, in progress in all of those categories. So what you can see here is you will be asked for your conflicts, your reviewer details, then there's the elements of the support, and then it still says evaluative criteria, but this is where you will go in and you will answer each one of the standards and required elements for standards 1 through 8. All right, that number 3 arrow there. We had encouraged you to go back and to look or download or save or review your self-study as it's in progress multiple times. This is where you're going to go in so that you can preview, you can print, you can get a PDF, however you'd like it, so that you could see all of this. in here. It shows you how things looked, how different things are appearing to you. You can see if you put something in there, does it make sense? Is it in the right place, etc. And that number 4, I just want to reiterate that additional materials button is only after a full self-study report has been completed, where you see in that status column, everything is complete and submitted. That's when you start to put in any new documents up until 30 days before the commission meets. Okay, next slide. This is an example of when you're in one of the elements there, your text editor, your font size, your URLs here. We try to use a consistent font. We do ask that you use either Arial or Tahoma 12 as a font. And please make sure you adjust for each of your responses there. If you see, for example, in this response, we've given you a number of URLs and websites there. Typically, if you did this in Word and you've already formatted that URL to be a live link, when you cut and paste it, it's often still live. Should it not be, or you need to hyperlink it within the portal, we've highlighted in red that button on the ribbon there that you would make sure that you can go to find that. And I think that this is one of the questions that goes about your character limit. We know the portal has 1 character limit. What we advise programs to look at is when you're writing a response to highlight it and use the word count that you see in Word. If you use that one, you're pretty, you can be pretty confident that your entire response, if it's within that limit, will fit into the text box for the required element. We want to reiterate that within these text boxes, you cannot upload a table or chart and copy and paste and put that in there. If for your response, you believe that that's very important, you could have your narrative here, and then that can be an appendix where it illustrates what you're looking for in that chart form. And I think we did touch again on this topic earlier. As Kevin said, it's very common beside your narrative that sometimes programs will do a 7C continuation, or maybe your curricular assessment, that 7C, you've done some unique things and you want to show the commission in that format to have an appendix associated with this. Thanks, Mike. Next slide. One of the other things that we want to point out in the portal, that besides the actual responses to each of the standards and required elements, there is a preface. And what this preface is we're going to ask you in a few paragraphs to give us a brief historical overview of the program. And this preface is simply that. You cannot attach any appendices here, so please do not put that in here. Don't try to put your upload file here. There is only one thing that we will ask you to put with that, but any appendices or things that go along into this is not available to the commissioner or to your site team, just the narrative, which is the brief overview. Okay.
I just want to know, it's the signature page and the SSR check-in.
Right. So what does go in there, which is actually going to be on my next slide, in case you've heard Mike. So we go to the next slide here. All appendices should or could be uploaded from the preface page. The answer is false to this. You can see that this is what your preface page looks like. And what you do attach to here is your signature page that will come from all the appropriate parties at the institution, as well as you'll see in the required forms a check-in list that you have verified. It's kind of a self-checklist that you have all of those components. But everything else, your scholarship forms, your CV, your Clin Ed sites, your contracts, your 7D tables, none of that goes here. Only those check-in forms and signature page. Okay, next slide. So here's times for our question. So Patrick, I am unsure of how we're handling the Internet Explorer issue at your university. I don't know, do the current commissioners, have they come across issues with getting the WinZip file uploaded?
I have not had to upload for a while, so just download. So I have not, I've not tried to upload. I have found Firefox often works, but I do think the Internet Explorer is a barrier for some.
Absolutely. So this is the type of issue. If this is happening and your university is blocking us, call staff, call myself, call Michael, and we will work with you on that. Any other questions as it relates to the portal, the standards, and or the process? And final slide, Mike. So once again, we do thank you very much. Feel free, this is my contact information to call or email questions that you may have. There's my direct number. There's also my cell phone number there to use. And if there's any questions, we encourage again for the chat, or if anybody needs to come to the microphone. And thank you, Vita, and everybody else. We hope this has been helpful to you. We appreciate you attending. I do believe the 2 other recordings are already been posted. You will be getting a survey shortly if you haven't gotten it already for you to provide feedback to us. And happy self-study. We wish you well. And I'm going to stop recording.